Oracle of the Forgotten, The Humans, The Wandering Swordsman, Part 3. It took Nalia some time to convince the swordsman that she was going to have to treat his wounds. Not nearly as long as she expected, though. Maybe he understood that he wasn't getting any answers from her until she had what she wanted first. The second she threw off her cloak and began to wash her hands in that run-down basin, it was all over anyway. He could fight or not. Ultimately, she was going to find a way to take care of him. After her offering to let him keep his weapon at his side and demanding to at least get his bleeding stopped, he finally gave in. If anything, Odilon figured she wouldn't be answering anything, no matter what he asked, unless she got her way, and it was obvious at least she knew more about the situation than he did. Still, as soon as the cloak came off, it was rather clear that she was bleeding as well. Beneath the broken part of her armor was bandages that were not so hidden themselves. She pulled the broken piece of shoulder armor off and tossed it to the side with her cloak. It was nothing but an annoyance hanging like that. Then she turned her attention back to him. As Odilon began to remove the chest piece that sat over his tunic, the half-demon noticed something that narrowed her eyes quickly. A wince, pain perhaps, but then suddenly there was blood, and a part of her felt it was too much too quickly. She rushed to his side, not really speaking, but rather trying to remove the shirt he was wearing. She needed to see that wound so she could tend to it, especially if it was actually bleeding that much. She wasn't thinking beyond that. Even if the blood had pooled beneath his armor, it shouldn't have seemed so fresh. "Aren't you eager to get my clothes off?" It was meant to be playful. If anything, the human was feeling a bit awkward, since most people didn't care about his state at all. For a moment, she paused. Did this human just... "Look here, you son of a..." But she fell silent. She realized no amount of being angry would fix the situation. She just assumed that if he was well enough to make such ridiculous statements, he was probably fine. Still, as she realized that the fabric was caught in his wound, she found herself with an odd half-smirk. Rather than say more, she reached down and tore it out harshly. "Fucking hell, woman!" His sharply cursed response was enough to make her feel a bit better. Watching him dig his fingers into the table seemed to satisfy her own need to silence him for a little bit. Still, if anything, she wasn't sure how he managed to make her so uncomfortable in the first place. With him standing there, it was hard to properly look at his wound, and it was definitely red and festering around the edges. She wasn't even conscious of the fact that she'd grabbed him by the shoulder with one hand, but she was fully aware when she forced him down to sit on the table behind him. Odilon was all too conscious of all of it. For a brief moment, he wasn't even sure how to react. There were men quite a bit larger than her that hadn't commanded and forced him to move with that much ease. The action took him back almost as much as her ripping the fabric out of his wound had. Up to this point, he'd mostly just enjoyed seeing her annoyed and flustered. He wasn't even fully sure why. The pain was easing some without the extra cloth in his wound, and a stinging and cooling sensation from the still-drying blood left him all too aware that it probably could do with having some air. Nalia demanded to know who bandaged him. "It looks horrible. This needed stitches." She paused, letting herself unwrap one of the ends of the bandage and loosen it slightly. "It's not even fully bandaged." In fact, she would have probably found it quicker to cut this than try and remove it. Looking at it, she figured it had partially closed into the wound. The infection was definitely not helping. "Sorry, Princess, we can't all be doctors." As his words hit her, she felt something boil up inside her. He was honestly just amused at this point. Somehow she'd shown more care and compassion in the last half hour than any human doctor had ever given him, despite her clear annoyance. Her random, frustrated expressions were almost enough to make him wonder exactly how human she was or wasn't. There was once or twice he almost saw her skin changing tone. He wasn't sure if she was flushing out of anger or something else. She didn't seem to be aware of it at all. This whole situation felt like some kind of cosmic joke. After all, demons had been trying to kill him off and on for as long as he remembered, even before his first recognized fight with one. But Odilon saw it instantly when he said the word princess. There was a flicker in that half-demon's amethyst eyes that he wished he had had more time to respond to. Nalia was coldly silent for a brief moment. There was a reason she was angry, and despite part of her knowing he couldn't know, she didn't care. The half-demon used her clawed nails to cut the bandage quickly, and then ripped as harshly as she could to pull out as much of the bandage and packing material from the wound at one time as possible. For a brief moment, she didn't even care that it had caused him to bleed quite a bit more than she intended. Sorry, Swordsman, we can't all be doctors. Still, she'd moved from some sadistic place to a more playful grin shortly after saying it. She felt she'd had her own revenge. Without the packing inside of this wound, she could see both how deep the wound was and random pockets of infection. Something washed over her, a sensation she wasn't wanting to feel. She brushed it aside, demanding to know how long it had been this way. She tried to hide her concern, but even Odilon couldn't fail to notice her eyes scanning him, as if looking for something, even a hint that there might be a better answer than she hoped. Being greeted by silence, she sighed silently. Then she reached into her bag to pull out a small, nearly empty silver case that had once been filled with ointment. She demanded that he lay down so that she could treat the wound correctly. She hadn't planned on sharing this specific treatment, and she knew she would soon have to make more. Once she set to work, she mostly ignored his reactions to her cleaning the wound. She could tell it was painful for him, but without removing the infection, she wasn't sure he'd make it through another month. She wasn't sure how long they'd be traveling, but it would take at least that to get to Trask, should she be able to convince him to go to the capital with her. Odilon had remained quiet. If anything, she figured he was probably tired of trying to taunt her for a bit. Still, she was enjoying the bit of peace while she was trying to focus. Once the wound was cleaned, she wiped her hands and began to apply the ointment to this wound. It would heal any remaining infection quickly, and even speed the healing of his body otherwise. It wasn't something she would normally share. It's expensive to make in ways she didn't wish to explain. When she finished, she sat him back up and went to wash her hands before fetching bandages. "You're actually not bad at this." His compliment wasn't expected, but it meant more to her than she wanted it to. She felt a smile crawl to her lips, wanted or not. Still, her mood hadn't quite repaired itself, despite the fact she was starting to actually enjoy his company. "I promise to patch you up. You can kill me when it heals if you want to." Nalia didn't really want to end her journey. Mortals usually tried to kill her eventually, though. Once he was bandaged, she asked him if he had anything else he needed looked at, then paused and almost reflexively spoke again. "If you say anything crude, I'm going to shove my spear so far up your ass it comes out your mouth." And for a moment, Odilon paused. He'd meant to try to irritate her with some random comment, so hers took him off guard. But the simple way she said it, as if she not only threatened, but had possibly done it a few times. No, I think I'm good. For a moment it was all he could say. He finally paused and tried to convince the girl to let him tend that bullet wound. Eventually she gave in, though her realizing that it would mean she had to remove her vest and shirt made her pause a moment. She knew the bandages that she already wore would cover anything important, but she felt a strange warmth coming to her skin. She just hoped the man would be too busy to notice, but when he took the time to ask her about it, she couldn't think enough to speak. Still, she eventually just told him to shut up and deal with the wound. She was surprised when he stopped her from removing her top entirely. Once it was low enough he could access the wound to bandage it, he told her it was enough and just went to work. That moment he realized just exactly how strong this girl must have been. She was covered in scars, burn marks that looked like some kind of acid or fire had been poured straight into her skin. She was riddled with cuts, wounds, bandages still wrapped around a good portion of her torso. She had stopped attacking him because he was injured, yet she was clearly hiding wounds of her own. From the look of it, a lot more than she wanted to admit. He wasn't sure where to begin, but with some reassurance, learned that the ball had gone straight through her shoulder. The place that had torn out her back had been bleeding the most, but the wound would need to be cauterized as well. She walked him through burning a piece of wood to jam into the wound and close it. Then, quite a bit more weakly, told him that he just needed to close the wound at the back. By then she'd partially collapsed, semi-conscious and exhausted from the sheer pain that this process had put her through. It wasn't long before she was leaning her head against his chest as he worked. She could barely move. The fact that she was suddenly dizzy was not helping. After he finished closing up her wound, she felt him take a breath and his entire body relax a moment. You know, I might hate demons, but if you wanted to cuddle, we could have talked about this. His words shook her back to reality for a moment. She was almost too tired to care. If you don't shut up, I'll headbutt you in the stomach. Still, after a bit more banter, it was clear she wasn't actually in the condition to fight at the moment. If anything, she was becoming quite a bit more playful with her responses, while seeming still a bit resentful about the whole situation. You look pretty harmless right now, Princess. His words were the end of her patience, though. She raised her right hand and hit him hard enough to nearly knock him over. Harmless, huh? Maybe you shouldn't let your guard down. That was the end of the banter for a bit. Nalia had somehow found enough energy to get up and return to the nearby basin. She fetched a small wooden cup out of a cabinet and began to fill it. Odilon realized she probably stayed here fairly often. She was still sipping her drink when she realized that there was only one man who had ever annoyed her so much, and he'd never gotten half the reaction out of her that this one did. Odilon. The words slipped her lips, and when the man responded, she said only that she wanted to be sure it was the right name. In truth, he was so different from the man who had the name before. If anything, he seemed to be much more relaxed and inclined to say inappropriate things. He went on a bit about how popular the name became after Kingy died. Somehow the use of that term nearly made her chuckle. She hadn't heard anyone say that in a long time. Odilon had finally decided to talk instead of mostly being silent or pushing her buttons. The human tried to convince her that maybe she just needed to talk to someone. Someone else, maybe. Her tone was a bit colder than she intended. He really wasn't used to this whole talking thing. It was always more of his brother's area than his. As he continued to ask questions, she mostly refused to answer.
She admitted to knowing that the wagon would come, however seemed to not care to discuss further. She didn't seem to really want to talk about what she was waiting for or why she was traveling that road in the first place. He was surprised to see her step back in and pull food out of her bag for them both. It wasn't much, yet they were still good rations, and he was not expecting her to want to share with him. Still, she realized he didn't trust her, and when she handed him the bread, she said it wasn't poisoned. The man paused a moment. Right, no, you're just different. He wasn't sure how to handle any of this now. I fight and kill demons all the time. He wasn't thinking as the next words just slipped out of his lips. It's weird for me to be treated better by some demon bitch than... And he stopped. He apologized as quickly as he could. She just seemed to deflate at the statement. Really, she should have known. It's all they ever see with her. Just another stupid demon. And no matter how he apologized for what he had said, she finally just shut him down. Well, you said it, and that's all they expect. She was done now. She had told him off as she wished to do to so many others. She didn't choose her parents. She didn't choose this life. She didn't choose anything but to try to do something better with it all. She didn't want to talk or even think anymore. She was feeling the fool for even thinking she might have a friendship in this. She had a duty, and that was all that mattered. Even with continued apologies, all he could get from her was a muttered, "Don't worry about it." She was done now. She just sat down and closed her eyes, allowing herself to silently meditate. She couldn't know the torment of the mortal, though. After all, she'd been so kind to him, and he'd done nothing but continue to hurt and anger her. And for that, he felt like an absolute jerk. Sometime later, she stretched, stirring once she was calm. The man began to speak, and she cut him off with a wave of her hand. You know, that mark, it calls unnatural things. Demons, beasts, spirits, trolls, even some of the most ancient creatures of the woods. Even with my visions, I couldn't see you there, and yet there you were. And I wanted nothing more than to tear you limb from limb and leave you for the forest to devour. I'm a dragoon. I wouldn't fight an injured man, but I wish to dishonor myself. I'm sorry. I never asked about that. The woman smiled, then cut him off again. You were about to ask, and I figured you should know. Now rest. Ask anything you want tomorrow. It wasn't long before she moved over to one of the medical beds and hid herself behind a curtain. She was done with this entire situation. She wanted nothing but sleep. The morning was going to be a journey all its own. Nalia was surprised to wake warm. A blanket had been draped over her. As she woke up even more, she learned that he'd lit a fire in the nearby fireplace. She was confused. No one had ever gotten near her without waking her. She learned from him that he'd washed her cloak and cleaned up while she was resting. He asked her about Trist. The woman explained the city was only a few days' journey, and asked him why he needed to know about the bandits' kingdom. It was somehow not shocking to learn that he was not welcomed there. She was, however, surprised when he volunteered to follow her to the village Bristol that she had mentioned the night before. When he asked more about what her plans were, she finally told him she wanted to check on one of the temples of the Old Faith, specifically of the Old Watch, who once guarded some of the cathedrals. At this point, he seemed interested in following her, and the woman decided to test him. I plan to travel to Trask. The fact is, that was one of the 2 places she meant to be. She was still scavenging for more supplies while she was speaking with him. Trask, the capital? That's insane. The place is practically hell between demon attacks and lords fighting to prove who's best at saving everyone. He was trying to caution her, but somehow he wasn't sure it would get very far. The woman smiled slightly at that, as if she weren't actually a demon herself. Demons vying for power, nothing more. I'd be more concerned by the ones that don't show it. Angels aren't always of the light. Of course she was being cryptic. She'd met her fair share of both, but she suspected so had he, and if he hadn't, he soon would. By now, the 2 were ready to leave the temple, and she had one last question. She asked him this time without demanding where he found that sword. It fell from the hand of a demon lord who couldn't hold on to it. Still, he had been quite insistent that no one else was to touch it for any reason, and she realized she'd have to give up on trying to get him to let her hold it. There was an essence, an energy about it that made her so uneasy, but the woman knew she would have to wait for any more answers. The entire walk to the next city was strangely uneventful, other than this constant sense of being watched, maybe even hunted. Despite knowing he didn't trust her, she offered to answer any questions he would have to the best of her ability. The sense of being watched only grew worse. She'd unconsciously begun walking faster, and the human couldn't help but notice it himself. Odilon also noticed a group gathering near a set of wooden poles nearby. At the same moment, Nalia pulled him aside, ushering him to silence. She wanted to ask him whether or not he was on good terms with the New Order. Not shockingly, his bounty wasn't just for angering one of them. It sounded like they all wanted a swing at the mortal. She found out that his group of bandits had, at some point, taken fancy to one of the priestesses of the New Order. The woman pinched the bridge of her nose, closing her eyes before growling slightly. "Let me guess. He stole her, and now you're all criminals. Fine, I'll figure out why they're here." Odilon waited where he'd pulled her aside off the trail. Really, it wasn't a bad spot. Nice rock to sit up against, and if anything bothered to drop by, he was likely to have it dead before it figured out what he was doing here. He wasn't expecting for the girl to literally just disappear in front of him. He seemed to have almost forgotten that she was half demon. As for Nalia, she used the opportunity to step outside the human realms again. If she could get closer, she could scout the situation without notice. Or so she thought. If she'd imagined that she would be so mistaken, she might have just entered the city normally. As she moved closer, she saw one of the guards' attention settle solely on her. Experience told her this could mean only a few things. He was either cursed, touched, marked, or... She paused. No, it started to fade into clarity quickly. Inside of the barrier of the places demons walked, she could see his nature fading into her vision, and it was genuinely horrifying. The entity guarding the gates to Bristol was not like any she'd ever seen before. He was hardly recognizable as a humanoid at all. First, his human eyes took on the form of mouths, snapping and lashing out at the air around them. Then his body slowly formed dozens and dozens of mouths. As he continued to watch her, his actual mouth enlarged, forming a single giant eye within a tentacled and distorted form. The red eye centered directly on her. For a brief moment, the human side of her forced her to freeze.
She knew he could see her gradually changing from her more human disguise to her natural form. She knew that he was a higher demon, perhaps even equal in status to some of the seraphim of the light. Nalia realized there was only one thing she could do now: hope that he wouldn't sense the lies that she was about to tell him. She first explained needing to move through the city to bypass the armies of darkness that were approaching where they were standing. The man said nothing, so she continued. She told him that she had a marked one, that she intended to take him to the capital as an offering to the Seraph Guard. It was a risk. The entity staring her down could have easily gone after the mortal himself, though she felt that might be a mistake. Such an offering, though, would garner so much favor with the guard. He could understand why the child was wanting to try. Even though the entity didn't speak, he nodded in approval. She knew that it had accepted her presence. The real question was how long they had before this became an actual issue for the two travelers. Without much thought, she ran back to the swordsman nearby. She appeared almost as suddenly as she began to speak. In that moment, he'd drawn his sword from the sheer suddenness of her appearance, but hearing her stopped him from slicing the girl in half. She explained the best she could that there was a demon and they didn't have much time to gather supplies and move on. She told him to keep his head down. "I just hope he doesn't intend to claim you himself." "Is he that kind of demon? I'm not the best-looking guy." Odilon's joke really didn't seem to amuse her at first. She reached a hand over to her weapon and tapped him on top of the head with her spear lightly. Honestly, more playful than anything. This time, it really didn't even hurt. It wasn't long before the pair was walking the trail back towards the city. Nalia drew her cloak tightly over her horns. When the guards stopped her, demanding to know who they were, the girl insisted they were just travelers who'd been attacked earlier, and all they wanted was supplies. The demon, hidden in his human form, looked over Odilon. "What about this one?" His words were actually just an indication he'd recognized what she already knew. He knew about the mark and was resisting the urge to kill the man already. She quickly explained that he was just another traveler she met who was on his way to visit family in Trask, and it seemed safer to travel together. The man stepped closer to her, blocking the view of his companions before gripping her chin tightly in his right hand. It took all of her willpower to keep from pulling her hidden blade and stabbing him. It wasn't long before the man lifted her, pulling her up so he could look into her eyes. He couldn't see her so clearly before, but here, it wasn't hard to get a good look at the girl. He dragged her until her feet were barely brushing the ground. He continued to lift her before looking over her face and horns. "It's a dangerous place, girl. You have 2 hours to get what you need and get out. If I see you again, you'll be dealt with." It wasn't an idle threat. He was more than willing to give her a chance, but that bounty would be hard to resist for too long. Odilon was doing all he could to restrain himself. Treating any woman like that was enough to set him off, but at the same time, he knew this wasn't the best time to cause a fight. They were in need of supplies, and the girl seemed to handle herself just fine. She fell to her knees as the large guardsman dropped her. The mortal helped her back up as the others left again. Nalia didn't know if the demon had recognized her or not, or if he even cared. She only hoped that his releasing them didn't come back to haunt them later. He was angry, probably more than he'd been in some time. Still, at her request, he didn't hunt the men down to have a talk with them. Those usually ended in bloodshed one way or another. Her explanation was that everyone treats her how that man did, and it was best to just move on and get out of the city. This didn't make him feel any better about the situation. Despite her nature, she'd regarded him with kindness and respect. She'd done nothing but try to help him after deciding that he was deserving of it. Her behavior had only varied slightly upon learning his name. Even before that, she'd taken on the task of healing him for a fair battle. Not many, if any, would have. With his reputation, most had always tried to take him out while he was vulnerable. When they finished their shopping, she informed him that they were going to Tradewinds. It was 2 days away, and it would be a much larger city than Bristol. She only hoped they were more welcoming than this one had been. She never had troubles in the past, but still it was hard to tell. The bigger surprise to both the swordsman and herself is that they were allowed to leave the village behind in peace. While no comfort to the human, the demon realized that it was a sign that there was still some honor among her own kind. With their new journey starting, she knew she couldn't dwell on things too much. After all, honor among demons was rare, but it was easily twisted into something else. She didn't realize the human walking with her was thinking much along the same lines. As much as he wanted to trust this new traveling companion, demons often turned so quickly, and as a half-demon she was always at risk of fully converting to one of their kind. And his past had taught him well that their kind had very few redeemable qualities. The man turned his focus on the next city, Tradewinds. He'd been there before. How long ago was it now? Was it even safe for travelers these days? Would they encounter trouble on their journey? There was no way to know right now, but they were certain to find out.